Our new house was nestled in a quiet suburb of New England, where people lived in harmony with nature, and the seasonal festivals were celebrated with tradition. But ever since we moved in 6 months ago, the house had been cloaked in a gloom I couldn't explain, especially on that Halloween night when everything took a turn for the worse. The night sky was pitch black, cold winds swept through the leaf-strewn streets, and the air of Halloween hung thick everywhere. I, Jackson, 12 years old, sat on the living room couch, watching my favorite horror movie. My little sister Lily had gone to bed early, but there was something unsettling about the silence in the house that made it impossible for me to focus on anything. Our house was far from the neighborhood, and ever since we'd moved here, strange noises had begun to surface at night. Sometimes it was the sound of soft footsteps. Other times it was the faint giggling from somewhere around the house, even though no one was visible. At first I chalked it up to the usual creaks and groans of an old house, but on Halloween night, the weirdness became undeniable. That night, when the clock struck midnight, a soft knock echoed from the window. I squinted outside, but the thick darkness swallowed up everything. I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, so I tried to ignore it. But the knocking grew louder, as if someone was demanding to be let in. A sense of dread washed over me. Chilled to the bone, I walked to the window and peered outside. There was nothing but still darkness and barren branches swaying in the breeze. As I returned to the couch, I suddenly heard a voice, soft but clear, as if it was echoing from the long, dark hallway. "Jackson, open the door." It wasn't the voice of anyone in my family. Startled, I spun around, but the hallway was empty, just faint shadows cast by the streetlights outside. Unease crawled up my spine, but I decided to check on Lily. She was still fast asleep, though her face showed signs of worry even in her dreams. I gently closed the door and headed back to my room. As I stepped into my room, a knock came from my bedroom door. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door, feeling like something wasn't right. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Trying to stay calm, I walked to the door and opened it. All I saw was the dark hallway, empty, no one there. Suddenly, from the end of the hallway, the voice returned, clearer now, but strange. "I know you're here. Let me in." A cold sensation engulfed me, like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing but darkness and an eerie silence. Then, banging on both doors, mine and Lily's, like someone was desperately trying to get in. The high-pitched giggle of a little girl echoed, stretching out in the narrow space. I rushed toward Lily's room, but just as I reached the door, everything went silent. The house returned to an eerie stillness, leaving only the sound of my pounding heart. I opened Lily's door, finding her still asleep, but something felt off. I could sense the presence of something invisible, something dark, hovering around us. The next morning, my mum came back from her Halloween party and asked about the night. I didn't tell her anything, but Lily, with tired, frightened eyes, spoke of the footsteps and giggling she'd heard all night. I looked at my mum, hoping she'd have a reasonable explanation for the weirdness, but she stayed quiet, worry flickering in her eyes. A few days later, I overheard a neighbor talking about our house. They said that it used to belong to a family who had lost their little girl in a tragic accident just before Halloween. The girl's name was Emily, and ever since her death, people said her spirit lingered here, especially on Halloween night. Emily was always looking for someone to play with, but whenever she tried to approach someone, she only brought fear and panic. I don't know what really happened that night, but deep down, I knew that girl wasn't just a figment of my imagination. She was a vengeful spirit, forever searching for someone to fill her loneliness and yearning. And that Halloween, we had become her target. Since that night, the strange occurrences continued in our house. The giggling at night, the odd footsteps, and the feeling that someone was always watching us from the shadows. No one in the family talked about it, but I knew we all sensed the presence of something that didn't belong to this world. Halloween isn't just about candy and spooky costumes. Sometimes, it's a time when restless spirits can return, searching for what they've lost. And we were just people passing through, caught up in the never-ending story of a girl named Emily. And from that point on, I understood that there are things beyond explanation, things that weave themselves into the fabric of our everyday lives. Spirits like Emily forever lurk in the shadows, waiting for someone to accept their invitation to play. That year, my family decided to spend an unusual Halloween vacation on a small island off the northern coast of California. Instead of the usual trips to crowded cities or theme parks, my parents wanted to find a quiet place, isolated from the outside world. After some searching, they rented an old seaside house on a remote island, with barely any signs of modern life. The island we arrived at had only about 5 or 6 other houses, all old and seemingly forgotten by time. The houses were scattered along the coastline, surrounded by thick woods and sheer cliffs that dropped into the sea. We were the only ones with children here. All the other residents on the island were over 60, except for a middle-aged man named Joe, whom we saw daily, sitting by the water, fishing. Joe seemed quiet and mysterious, but his presence made me feel an inexplicable sense of unease. From the moment we set foot on the island, I sensed something strange. Everything on the island seemed to have existed for centuries, from the houses with their weathered rooftops to the creaky doors that groaned when opened. The house we rented was no exception. The furniture was old, from the tables and chairs to the beds with linens that had yellowed with age. There was no TV, no phone, and the only source of water was an ancient well in the backyard. It felt like stepping back into the early 20th century. Our first evening on the island passed peacefully. My parents cooked a simple dinner with the fish my dad had caught from the shore. What surprised us was that right after dinner, the elderly women from nearby unexpectedly dropped by, bringing blueberry pies and strange gifts. They didn't say much, only smiled in an odd way and quietly handed over the gifts before leaving. It seemed like they knew exactly what we were doing and when we were doing it, as if the island held secrets only they understood. The following nights, strange events began. On the third night, after we had gone to bed, my parents started to hear singing from a distance. My dad thought it might be the sound of waves crashing against the rocks or the wind rustling through the trees. But the singing continued, echoing through the stillness of the night. It sounded like a choir, but the sound was too distant and too harmonious to be just the wind. The next morning, my parents asked the neighbors about the strange singing, but no one knew anything about it. The elderly woman who lived closest just shrugged and smiled slightly. "Maybe it's just the sounds of the island," she said, but there was a mysterious glint in her eyes that was hard to read. Fear slowly crept into our family, but no one wanted it to ruin the vacation. My parents decided not to mention it again, but I knew they were still unsettled by the singing from the night before. I, too, couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine whenever I thought about it. The night before the final night of our trip, things came to a head. That night, I was lying in bed, staring out the window. The sea breeze howled through the trees and rattled the windows, causing the house to creak. Suddenly, the singing started again. This time, it was clearer than ever before. No longer just vague sounds, It was the unmistakable voices of children singing in the darkness. The voices were high-pitched and steady, but something felt very wrong about the melody. It was as if the children were singing a mournful, eerie song. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding. My parents had also woken up, their eyes filled with worry. Unable to suppress our curiosity, we decided to go outside and find the source of the singing. The night was pitch black, with only the faint light of the moon illuminating the path leading to the shore. We stepped out of the house and into the cold night. The singing seemed to come from the forest behind the house, but as we got closer, it shifted, as if someone was moving in the darkness, slipping between the ancient trees. We stumbled through the dark, each step filled with growing unease. There was no light, no people, just the eerie singing echoing across the island. We wandered through the forest for a while, but couldn't find the source of the singing. Eventually, when the singing stopped abruptly, we returned to the house, but the fear lingered. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint sounds, like footsteps gliding across the floor, the wind whistling through the cracks in the doors, and the distant murmur of the singing. The next morning, my dad began to look through the old books and photos in the house, trying to uncover something about its past. In a forgotten corner of the library, he found an old scrapbook dating back to the 1920s. When he opened the book, we discovered something that made everything clearer and far scarier. The house had once been an old school, and one of the photos in the scrapbook showed a girl's choir, small children, standing in a row with deep, hollow black eyes and mysterious smiles. Our entire family was stunned, speechless. We had been hearing the singing of this choir every night, but they no longer existed. Those spirits still haunted this place, singing their mournful song in the dark, like a reminder of a forgotten past. We packed up immediately and left the island the next day. Even though we had left that place behind, the memory of those terrifying Halloween nights, with the singing of invisible children, still haunts me to this day. I grew up in a small riverside town called Ridgeline in southern Missouri. The town was once peaceful, but had long been overshadowed by issues of vice and addiction. My teenage years there were filled with wandering in search of adventure, most of which involved abandoned, decrepit, and eerily haunted places. It was Halloween when I was 16, a time when youthful curiosity and the spooky atmosphere pushed me and my friends to explore mysterious places. Jamie, one of my closest friends, was always the ringleader of these strange adventures. He'd just heard about an abandoned house deep in the woods, about 5 miles from town. The house had been empty for a long time, but what caught our attention were the rumors surrounding it. People said that outlaws used the house for shady activities. That night, the sky was overcast and chilly, with the wind howling through the bare trees, whipping the fallen leaves into eerie rustling sounds. We decided to go to the house around 10 p.m., when darkness had fully enveloped the area. Jamie, Sarah, Ben, and I piled into Jamie's old pickup truck and set off into the woods. The road leading to the house was terrifying, full of potholes and fallen branches blocking the way. The truck's headlights flickered over the trees, casting swaying shadows that felt almost alive. When we arrived, the house loomed before us like something out of a nightmare. The entire front was ruined, windows shattered, and overgrown vegetation surrounded it. The air was freezing, and I could smell something odd, like chemicals mixed with damp mold. The front door was stuck, but Jamie, with his usual brute strength and impulsiveness, shoved his shoulder into it, forcing it open with a loud, ghostly creak. As we stepped inside, The interior was so dark, we had to switch on our flashlights, just to see where we were going. The light revealed peeling walls, old furniture, and piles of trash and dust. The house looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Sarah stopped in front of a small entryway leading to the basement, and pointed out something strange, a tin can filled with rocks, with a wire strung right below ankle height. I froze for a moment before realizing it could be a homemade trap. My heart began to race, but we were all too curious to turn back now. We continued deeper into the house, and with each step, the air grew heavier. In certain corners, the foul stench of chemicals became apparent. It was acrid, as if it was stabbing up into our nostrils every time we inhaled. Ben said it might be bleach or something similar, but we all felt uneasy. As we climbed the stairs, they creaked loudly, and broken shards of glass crunched underfoot with every step. The atmosphere grew more oppressive by the minute. The house was eerily silent, as if forgotten by time, yet something seemed to be lurking in the darkness. Jamie and I led the way, while Sarah and Ben hesitated behind us. When we reached the top of the stairs, a horrifying sight greeted us. A gaunt man, with wild eyes and sickly pale skin, stood in the middle of the hallway. He held a handgun, his hand trembling so badly it looked like he could barely control it. He whipped around to face us, his crazed eyes wide with terror. "Who the hell are you? What do you want here?" he shrieked, his high-pitched voice echoing throughout the house. We stood frozen for a few seconds, unable to move. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, cold sweat trickling down my spine. Jamie was the first to react. He grabbed my hand and shouted, "Run!" We turned and ran as fast as we could. Our footsteps pounded against the floor, and the sound of our frantic breathing mixed with the chaos. I could hear the man's deranged laughter behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We bolted out of the house and didn't stop until we reached the pickup truck. We jumped into the truck, and Jamie hastily started the engine. The truck sped away, leaving that haunted house far behind. We all breathed heavily, too shaken to speak. I looked out the window and watched the house fade into the darkness, but the fear didn't leave me. Once we were safely away, Jamie turned to me, his face pale but his eyes sharp. "Did you see the trap?" he asked. "We're lucky we got out of there." That night, we realized that the abandoned house wasn't just an old, decaying place. It was a meth lab, a dangerous place we'd stumbled into. We never told anyone about what had happened, but I knew from that night forward, I'd never forget the fear that house instilled in me. A few years later, I returned to Ridgeline, driving down that same old road, and saw that the house had been torn down. The lot was empty, with no trace of the terror it had once held. But I still can't forget that Halloween night, the night we came face to face with the most terrifying thing of our lives. The town of Deep Hollow isn't the kind of place where you'd expect strange things to happen, at least not at first glance. It was a quiet, forgotten place with a fading main street, dense woods that seemed to swallow sound, and people who kept to themselves. My mom and I lived in a creaky two-story house built back in the late 1800s, a relic from a time when the town had flourished. The house had seen generations come and go, and sometimes you could feel that history pressing down on you. Like the air itself was thicker with the weight of long-forgotten secrets. The wood floors groaned under every step, and no matter how softly you walked, every sound on the first floor carried up to the second. Living in that house, I quickly learned one thing. Nothing stayed hidden for long. That Halloween night, my mum left me alone with her laptop while she worked a late shift. It wasn't unusual for her to work nights, and I didn't mind having the house to myself. at least not usually. But there was something different about that night. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the house felt expectant, like it was waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake it off, sprawled across my bedroom floor, chatting with friends online. The upstairs was carpeted, but the first floor still had its old hardwood floors, scarred and groaning with age. I was used to hearing footsteps below, used to the way the sounds traveled up through the walls. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was that those familiar noises were about to take a sinister turn. Around 7 p.m., I heard my mum's car pull into the driveway. It was her black sedan. I'd recognize the sound of that engine anywhere. I hurried to shut my laptop, worried she'd catch me using it without permission. From my room, I heard the familiar sounds, the front door creaking open, her footsteps on the hardwood, the soft thud of bags being dropped on the desk. It was the routine of it that put me at ease. I knew those sounds as well as I knew my own heartbeat, and I didn't think twice about them. But halfway down the stairs, everything changed. I stopped cold. The house, every light in it, was pitch black. It wasn't just dark. It was the kind of darkness that feels alive, pressing in around you like it's waiting to swallow you whole. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat sharp and jagged. How could she have come in without turning on any lights? I stayed frozen for a moment, straining to listen, hoping to hear the shuffle of her footsteps or the rustle of her bags. But there was only silence, a silence so thick it seemed to hum. Slowly, I crept down another step, squinting into the dark. And that's when I saw it, or rather, what I didn't see. Her car wasn't in the driveway. The streetlight outside cast a dim yellow glow, illuminating the empty stretch of pavement. No sign she had ever been there. That's when the fear hit me. It came fast and hard, tightening around my chest. If my mum wasn't home, then who had opened the door? I spun on my heel and bolted back upstairs, slamming my bedroom door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, finally clicking it into place. Grabbing the phone, I dialed her number with trembling fingers. She picked up on the first ring, her voice calm, oblivious to my growing panic.
"I'm still on my way, honey,"
she said.
"I'll be home in about 30 minutes.
I dropped the phone onto the bed, my breathing shallow and rapid. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a trick of my imagination, a misunderstanding, but then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, pacing across the floor below. They weren't hurried or random, they were measured, purposeful, as if whoever or whatever was down there was searching for something. The sound echoed up through the floorboards, creeping into the marrow of my bones. I grabbed the phone again and tried calling my friends. One after another, each call ended with a busy signal. It was as if the world outside had sealed itself off, leaving me trapped with the unseen presence below. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, like multiple people were now moving back and forth. My pulse hammered in my ears, my throat dry with fear. I knew I couldn't stay locked in my room forever. I had to find out what was happening. Swallowing hard, I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The floor creaked beneath my feet, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. The air felt thick, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I moved toward the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. And just as my foot touched the top stair, the footsteps below started again. This time, they matched my movements, step for step. I descended slowly, my heart thundering in my chest. The house remained steeped in darkness, save for the faint light filtering through the windows. Long, thin shadows stretched across the walls, their shapes shifting and twisting with each step I took. I reached the bottom and forced myself to move toward the living room, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run. But the room was empty. There was nothing, just silence, thick, oppressive silence, as if whatever had been there had disappeared the moment I arrived. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed the laptop and sprinted back upstairs, slamming my door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I opened the screen and frantically messaged a friend, typing out everything that had just happened. But before I could finish, the lights downstairs flickered on, all at once. The footsteps stopped, and the house went still. It was the kind of stillness that feels wrong, like the calm before a storm. And then I heard it, the sound of the front door opening. My mum walked in, her keys jingling, bags rustling. She greeted me like nothing had happened, oblivious to the terror I'd just experienced. I ran downstairs, breathless, stumbling over my words as I told her everything. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed with concern, but there was no answer in her eyes.
It was probably just your imagination,
She said, though I could tell she didn't entirely believe it herself. And I knew, deep down, that it hadn't been my imagination. The strange things didn't stop after that night. They lingered, like a shadow that follows too closely. Every now and then, when I was alone, I'd hear those same heavy footsteps pacing, searching, never finding. I never had the courage to investigate further. Some doors are better left unopened. And that Halloween night in Deep Hollow, well, it taught me that the scariest things aren't always the ones you see. Sometimes, the real horror lies in what almost reveals itself, in the things lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. My boyfriend, Nick, and I had only just begun what we believed would be the next great chapter of our lives. The old house, nestled in the rolling hills of Colorado, promised so much. A spacious home surrounded by sprawling gardens and dense woods, far from the noise and troubles of the modern world. The air there seemed fresher, the stars brighter, and we were eager to leave the past behind us and start anew. But excitement has a way of curdling, and soon the promise of peace gave way to something else entirely. Something dark, unsettling, and impossible to explain. When we arrived, the house was in need of serious repairs. The kitchen walls sagged with age, and the master bedroom required new flooring. Nick worked long hours, leaving me to handle the unpacking and oversee the repairs alone. With no furniture to fill the space yet, the house felt hollow, as if it echoed with memories not our own. The wooden floors whispered with every step, each creak magnified by the emptiness. But there was one place in particular, the small bedroom across the house, that seemed to carry a presence I couldn't shake. It was the first room we had chosen to sleep in upon arriving, but something about it felt off, like stepping into a place where you weren't welcome. I would stand in the doorway, my breath shallow, my skin prickling as if the air itself wanted me out. There were no words for the sensation, a paralyzing fear that gripped me every time I lingered too long. Though nothing tangible ever happened in that room, the oppressive feeling it carried was enough to drive me away. One night, while Nick was away on business, I decided to try sleeping in that dreaded room, accompanied only by Max, our loyal dog. I told myself that fear was irrational, just an overactive imagination feeding off the silence of an old house. But the moment I lay down, I knew I had made a mistake. The room felt suffocating, the darkness thick as though it had mass. It pressed down on me, and I swore I could feel unseen eyes lingering in the shadows. Max whimpered beside me, ears pinned back, as if sensing what I could not. By 4 in the morning, my nerves shattered. Grabbing Max by the collar, I fled to the safety of my car and waited for the sun to rise, trembling in the cold pre-dawn air. A week later, the repairs were finally complete, and we moved into the new master bedroom on the opposite side of the house. I told myself the worst was behind us. Emma, a close friend, arrived shortly after with her husband, who, like Nick, had to leave for military training. For the next few weeks, Emma and I would be left alone in the house. At first, we welcomed solitude, imagining cozy nights and idle conversations. But as fate would have it, our nights together coincided with the creeping presence of Halloween. The first night Emma stayed, she knocked on my door in the dead of night, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She claimed her bed had started shaking violently, so much so that she couldn't bear to stay in that room a moment longer. I laughed it off, thinking she had dreamed it, and told her she could sleep in my room. But no sooner had we settled down than the bed beneath us began to tremble, soft at first, then harder, until it felt like the earth itself had come alive. We lay in frozen silence, too afraid to speak, waiting for the shaking to cease. It did, but not for long. The following night, both Emma's bed and mine quaked again. This time, the tremors felt deliberate, as if something unseen had decided to torment us. Stranger still, the disturbances only happened when no one else was in the house, only Emma and me, alone in the vast emptiness. The room Emma had been staying in was, of course, the same one that had filled me with such unexplainable dread. After that night, she refused to sleep there again. One evening, she told me that although she had closed the closet door and turned off the fan before going to bed, she woke to find the door wide open and the fan spinning at full speed. Worse, she swore she heard scratching noises inside the closet, like claws scraping against wood, as if something trapped within was desperate to escape. From that point on, we avoided the room entirely, though the feeling of being watched never left us. Even walking past the door made the air grow heavier, as if the shadows inside were coiled tight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then came the night the lights went out. Emma was in the bathroom, and I was in the bedroom, when, without warning, both rooms were plunged into darkness. At first, I thought it was a power outage, but when we checked the rest of the house, every other light was still on. Only the two rooms we occupied were affected. Puzzled and unnerved, I called my father, an experienced electrician, but he insisted everything should be working fine. After nearly 20 minutes of arguing over the phone, we returned to the bedroom, only to find the lights flickered back on as though nothing had ever been wrong. Determined to uncover the truth, we set up a video camera in the kitchen, aiming it down the hall toward the bedrooms. It was Halloween night, and we wanted proof, anything to confirm what we had been experiencing. The camera was fully charged, set to record for 4 hours, but when we reviewed the footage the next morning, what we found chilled us to the bone. The video was distorted, the images warped, and shadows flickered across the walls, shadows that didn't belong to any of us. Worse, the battery had drained after just 6 minutes, though we had charged it to full. As time passed, the strange occurrences continued, though they became less menacing. One night, we gathered around a bonfire with Nick's friends. The men went inside to grab beer and snacks, leaving Emma and me alone by the fire. Suddenly, Stark, one of the guests, burst out of the house, his face ashen and eyes wide with terror. He claimed to have seen 3 men standing silently around the fire, men dressed in Civil War uniforms. Stark wasn't drunk, and the fear in his voice left no room for doubt. We sat in stunned silence, unable to dismiss his story. After that night, the disturbances grew quieter. Small things like furniture shifting slightly or objects disappearing and reappearing in strange places. We learned to live with the strangeness, even laughing about it. When guests stayed overnight, we pretended not to notice as their beds or sofas shook beneath them, grinning as they nervously tried to explain it away. But beneath the humor lay an unsettling truth. Despite everything, we never truly saw anything. There were no clear apparitions, no ghostly figures, only fleeting shadows and the relentless feeling that something unseen was always watching. That house remains etched in my memory, especially the events of that Halloween. It was a place where the boundary between the living and the dead felt paper-thin, where shadows whispered secrets from another time. And though we never discovered what haunted those halls, one thing was certain. It had chosen to reveal just enough to remind us that we were never truly alone. And perhaps, somewhere in those endless shadows, it is still waiting. I never believed in ghost stories or rumors about cursed items, until one strange day when I stumbled upon an eerie old phone at a peculiar antique market. I had just moved to Texas 3 months ago to start my university life. Being new to the area, I wanted to find something special to decorate my dorm room and make it feel more like home. I was still adjusting to the new environment and felt a bit out of place. So I thought getting some unique decorations might help. One evening in late October, after classes, a couple of friends, Harry and Julian, invited me to explore a local antique market. They heard it was full of strange, vintage items. And since Halloween was just around the corner, they figured it might be fun to check out. We drove to the market on the outskirts of the city. As we approached, the rain started to pour, and a thick fog covered the ground, making everything look gloomy and mysterious. The market itself was small and looked old, with only a few stalls scattered under a worn-out canopy. The entire place seemed almost abandoned, surrounded by bare trees, muddy paths, and dim, flickering lights that cast eerie shadows. The moment we stepped out of the car, I felt a strange chill creeping up my spine. The air was heavy, and everything seemed covered in a thin layer of dust. The few people browsing looked just as strange as the items on display. It was as if everyone around us belonged to another time. Something about the place felt wrong. It was quiet, almost too quiet, like the market was holding its breath.
Why are we even here?
Harry grumbled, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around nervously.
Come on, it's Halloween season.
Julian replied, shrugging.
Maybe we'll find something creepy and fun.
But it's freezing. And look at this place. It's just filled with old junk.
Just give it a chance, I said, even though I also felt uneasy. I didn't want to admit it, but I had a bad feeling in my gut. We walked around the market, our shoes squelching in the mud. Most of the stalls were closed, their wares covered in faded tarps. The open stalls sold an assortment of dusty items, vintage cameras, old clocks, tarnished jewelry, and cracked ceramics. There were even creepy dolls with broken faces and empty eye sockets, which only added to the weird vibe.
What's the point of digging through all this junk?
Harry muttered as he picked up a rusty pocket watch and turned it over in his hand. I don't know, I admitted, glancing around. But maybe we'll find something interesting. Something unique. We kept walking, and that's when I noticed it. A small stall hidden in the farthest corner of the market. It looked like it hadn't had a customer in years. Out of curiosity, I moved closer. The stall was cluttered with random items, faded photographs, worn-out books, and strange trinkets that seemed to have been forgotten by time. But sitting alone on a dusty shelf was what caught my eye, a small, old flip phone. The phone looked completely out of place among the other items, It was the kind of phone people used in the early 2000s, with big number buttons and a tiny screen. In a world of sleek, modern smartphones, this one seemed like an ancient artifact. I reached out and picked it up. The plastic case was yellowed, the buttons worn out. I turned it over in my hand, and for some reason, I felt drawn to it, like the phone was calling to me. It felt almost alive.
What did you find?
Harry asked, peering over my shoulder. I'm not sure. Just an old phone, I said slowly, unable to take my eyes off it.
You're not seriously thinking of buying that, are you?
Yes, I think I will, I replied, surprising myself. I didn't know why, but something inside me insisted that I had to take it.
Who cares? It's just a piece of junk.
Harry muttered, shaking his head, but I ignored him and turned to the shopkeeper. He was an old man, hunched over behind the counter, watching us silently. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his eyes were sunken, almost hollow. There was something unsettling about the way he stared at me.
You want this phone?
Yes. How much is it? I asked. The old man leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. He studied me carefully, as if searching for something. Then, slowly, he smiled, twisted, crooked smile that made my skin crawl.
It's yours, but remember, never turn it on at night.
A shiver ran down my spine. What do you mean? I asked, confused by his words.
Just be careful. Once it's yours, it'll never leave you.
Feeling uneasy, I quickly thanked him and left, clutching the phone in my hand. As I rejoined my friends, Harry was still looking at me like I had lost my mind.
Let's just go home. This place is giving me the creeps.
I agreed, and we left the market. But even as we drove back to the campus, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had made a mistake. Back in my dorm room, I placed the phone on my desk and stared at it. Why had I even taken it? It was just an old, useless piece of technology. But no matter how hard I tried to forget about it, I felt drawn to it. I wanted to know what secrets it held. After dinner, I finally gave in to my curiosity and picked it up. To my surprise, when I pressed the power button, it turned on without any problem. Despite being so old, the screen lit up smoothly. The battery was almost empty, but one thing caught my attention. A message appeared on the screen. Is anyone there? My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen, confused. Who had sent that? I opened the message and saw that it was from an unknown number, sent many years ago. I felt a strange unease, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just an old text left by the previous owner. I almost deleted it, but decided to leave it. I turned off the phone and put it back on my desk. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the phone. It made no sense, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone knows something was watching me from the dark. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like there were eyes staring at me. Around midnight, I heard a faint clicking sound. My eyes flew open, and I sat up in bed, staring at the desk. The phone screen was glowing softly in the dark. My heart raced. No way, I whispered. I knew I had turned it off. I slowly got out of bed and walked over to the desk. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and saw a new message. Don't leave me. I dropped the phone in shock and stumbled back. How was this possible? Who had sent the message? I didn't want to think about it anymore. I shoved the phone into my drawer, locked it, and tried to forget about it. But the next night, as I was getting ready to sleep, I heard it again. That same clicking sound. I looked over and saw a faint glow coming from the drawer. I opened it slowly, my hands shaking, and saw the phone was on. Another new message appeared. Did you forget about me? A chill ran down my spine. I took the battery out and placed everything on the desk, hoping that would stop it. But no matter what I did, every night, the phone would turn back on by itself and show me strange messages. "I'm so lonely. Why are you ignoring me?" And then the nightmares began. It started slowly, small, unsettling dreams that would leave me feeling disturbed and uneasy when I woke up. In the first few nights, I'd find myself wandering in dark hallways, endless corridors that stretched on forever. There would be no sound except for the soft, eerie clicking noise echoing from somewhere deep within the shadows. I would walk and walk, but the hallway would never end. And at the very end, there would always be a faint, glowing light, the screen of the phone floating in the darkness. Each night, the dreams became more vivid, more intense. I would find myself standing in a large, empty room. The walls were bare, the floor cold and made of rough stone. The only source of light came from the phone in my hand, its screen casting a pale glow. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the screen as messages appeared one by one. "We belong together. Don't you want to be my friend? You'll never leave me." I would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. No matter what I did, the dreams would return, pulling me deeper and deeper into the darkness. My body felt heavy during the day, as if some invisible weight was pressing down on me. My grades started to drop because I couldn't concentrate. I stopped going out with friends. Harry and Julian tried to check in on me, but I kept pushing them away.
Man, you look terrible.
Harry said one afternoon. We were sitting in my room, but I could barely keep my eyes open. Every night was a battle, and I hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks. "I'm fine," I muttered, staring at the phone on my desk. I hadn't touched it since the second night, but it was always there, waiting. Even with the battery removed, it would somehow turn on by itself every evening, its soft glow taunting me.
Seriously, what's going on? You've been acting weird ever since you got that stupid phone.
I hesitated. I wanted to tell them. I wanted to throw the phone away, to destroy it, to smash it into a million pieces and be free. But every time I tried, something stopped me. It was like a voice whispering in my head, warning me not to. I shook my head. "I just need some rest," I said softly. "I'll be okay." But I wasn't okay. That night, the dreams took a darker turn. I was standing in the same dark room, the cold floor pressing against my bare feet. But this time, I wasn't alone. I could feel the presence of something else. It was there, lurking in the shadows, watching me. My hand trembled as I held the phone. The screen flickered, and a new message appeared. "Turn around." I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to keep looking at the phone. But my body moved on its own. Slowly, I turned around, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its form shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze cold, unblinking eyes boring me. My heart pounded as the figure took a step closer.
"Why are you ignoring me?"
The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it echoed in my head like a thunderclap. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took another step, and another. I stumbled back, the phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the ground.
"Don't leave me."
It reached out a long, pale hand, fingers stretching toward me. I turned and ran, the darkness closing in around me. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape. The figure's voice followed me, growing louder and louder.
"We belong together, forever."
And then, just as the figure's hand brushed against my shoulder, I woke up. I shot up in bed, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The room was dark and silent, but I could feel the cold sweat on my skin. Slowly, I looked over at the desk. The phone was glowing again. With shaking hands, I picked it up. A new message was waiting. "You can't run from me." My hands trembled, and I dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the screen flickering. I stared at it, my mind racing. This had to stop. I couldn't live like this anymore. I grabbed my phone, my real phone, and called Harry.
Dude, it's 3 in the morning.
"Please, I need help. I need to get rid of it."
Get rid of what?
"The phone. That cursed phone. I have to destroy it."
Okay, just calm down. I'll come over in the morning, okay? We'll figure this out.
True to his word, Harry showed up the next morning, looking groggy but concerned. I hadn't slept at all. I'd spent the entire night staring at the phone, afraid to look away.
Okay, show me.
I handed him the phone. He looked it over, frowning.
It's just an old phone. Man, are you sure?
"It's not just a phone," I snapped. It's something else. It's alive."
Okay, let's smash it then.
He grabbed a hammer from his car and brought it down hard on the phone. The screen shattered and the case cracked. I let out a sigh of relief. But then, something strange happened. The pieces of the phone started to twitch. Slowly, they slid across the ground, pulling back together. Within seconds, the phone was whole again, the screen glowing softly. No.
What the hell?
"I told you, it won't let me go." A new message appeared on the screen. "You can't destroy me." I turned and ran out of the dorm, Harry calling after me. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. I drove for hours, heading out of town and into the countryside. Finally, I stopped at a small river deep in the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water. I grabbed the phone and walked to the edge of the river. "This ends now," I whispered. I took the phone apart, ripping out the battery, the SIM card, every piece I could find. I threw each piece into the river, watching them sink one by one. The water swallowed them up, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. But when I turned back to the car, I froze. The phone was lying on the hood, whole and intact, its screen glowing softly. My hand shook as I picked it up. A new message appeared. "You can't leave me. Forever." I dropped the phone and stumbled back. My vision blurred, and the world spun around me. I could hear a faint whisper in the wind, calling my name. That night, I woke up in a place I didn't recognize. I was standing in a cold, dark room. The air was thick and heavy, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. My hands were holding the phone tightly, and the screen was glowing with a soft, eerie light. Where am I?
We're together now.
I turned slowly. The figure was there, standing in the shadows. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and its smile stretched wide across its face. No, please.
You belong to me. You'll never leave.
The room began to spin, the walls closing in around me. I could feel the darkness pulling me down, wrapping around me like a vice. And then, just as I felt myself slipping away, the phone's screen flickered. A new message appeared. "Forever." After the horrifying visions and being trapped in the dark room with the ominous figure, I realized something. I wasn't going to let it take control of my life anymore. It might be powerful, it might have its twisted influence on me, but I still had one thing: my own willpower. I looked down at the glowing phone in my hand. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy, almost as if it was feeding off my fear. But then I noticed something else. A tiny crack in the screen. A small flaw I hadn't seen before. A plan started forming in my mind. If the phone could be broken, even if just a little, maybe I could destroy it once and for all. Gathering all my courage, I tightened my grip around the phone. I remembered what the shopkeeper had said: never turn it on at night. But maybe, just maybe, I could use that to my advantage. I pressed the power button hard, and suddenly, the glow from the phone intensified, flooding the entire room with blinding light. The figure shrieked, stumbling back as if the light was burning it. The shadows around me flickered and wavered. I felt the phone tremble in my hand, as if it was trying to escape my grip. But I held on tight and pushed even harder. Then there was silence. The darkness lifted, and I found myself standing in my dorm room. Everything looked normal. The desk, the books, even the curtains swaying softly in the breeze. I blinked, feeling dazed, and looked down at the phone. It was completely destroyed. The screen was shattered, and the battery was leaking. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. Truly free. I picked up the pieces carefully and walked out of my dorm room. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the campus. I headed straight to the local scrapyard and tossed the remains of the phone into the crusher. I watched as the machine grounded down into nothing but dust and metal fragments. "Goodbye," I whispered. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. The nightmares didn't come back. The whispers stopped, and my life slowly returned to normal. It's been a year since that terrifying experience. I graduated from university, got a good job, and moved into a new apartment. Things have been peaceful, and I've even started dating again. No more mysterious messages, no more haunted dreams. I finally feel like myself again. Sometimes, I still think about that phone and the creature that was trapped inside it. What was it? A ghost? A demon? I'll probably never know. But I do know one thing. I survived. I didn't let it take me, and I didn't become a victim. And so, my life continued, brighter and happier, free from the shadows that once haunted me. My story begins with distant memories from when I was a child, and we would often visit my grandparents during holidays, even though my family didn't live in the same town. These visits were usually full of joy and warmth. My grandparents lived in a quiet neighborhood, and just 2 houses down was my aunt's house. It was a small community where nearly everyone knew each other, but there was one house between my grandparents' house and my aunt's. A house that had long become the subject of hushed talks among the children in the family, and it wasn't a pleasant story. The woman who lived there was a terrifying figure in our eyes. She was tall, much larger than any woman I had ever seen, probably over 6 feet. Every time she appeared in the yard, we felt chills. She often wore dresses and large boots meant for heavy labor, along with a wooden chain around her neck. Sometimes we would catch her working in the back garden or scrubbing the exterior of her house. Her strange cleaning of the outside of her home always made us uncomfortable, as if she was trying to hide something. She would shout at us children, calling us crude and unpleasant names. Even more frightening, she often warned us that the devil would come for us if we didn't stay away from her. The adults in the family, including my parents, always told us not to pay attention to her and to stay away. Naturally, this only made us kids more scared and curious. Every time we had to walk from my grandparents' house to my aunt's, we would dash past her house, knowing full well that she would be watching us from the window, her eyes staring at every step we took. Those glances were enough to send chills down anyone's spine. So, none of us, ever dared to pass by alone. It was an unspoken rule among the children. Then one Halloween night, when all the kids in the family gathered at my grandparents' house to prepare for trick-or-treating, one of my cousins, Tommy, came up with a bold idea. He dared us to trick-or-treat at that woman's house. I remember the fear welling up inside me, but I didn't want to be labeled a coward. I knew if I refused, I would be teased endlessly. Besides, I wasn't going alone, we'd go together as a group. And with more people, the fear seemed to lessen slightly. We approached the house, my heart pounding. The kids were silent. No one spoke a word. Tommy, the bravest, went ahead and rang the doorbell. At first, nothing happened. I sighed in relief, thinking maybe she wasn't home. But then, suddenly, a series of loud bangs came from inside the house, like doors slamming repeatedly. When the door opened, there she was, but this time, she wasn't just standing there watching us. In her hand, she held a severed human head. I couldn't tell if it was real or just a Halloween prop, but in that moment, all of us screamed in terror. We ran as fast as we could back to my grandparents' house, hearts racing. The adults, after hearing what happened, just laughed and said we had bothered her and deserved a scare. They told us it was just a Halloween prank, and the head was surely a prop, but still. I couldn't shake the chilling feeling from seeing her hold that head, her cold, emotionless eyes staring at us. Things seemed to have ended after that night, but a month later, something horrific happened. It was late in the afternoon when my aunt, who lived just 2 houses away from the woman, was coming home from the grocery store. She had bags in one hand and my younger cousin in the other. As she was about to enter her house, the woman suddenly appeared behind her. She had a small wire saw, the kind used to cut trees, and crept up behind my aunt. From what my parents later told me, the woman looped the wire saw over my aunt's head and around her neck, then began pulling hard. My aunt panicked, but survival instincts kicked in, and she immediately turned, kicking the door hard enough to knock the woman off balance. As the noise erupted, my uncle who was inside rushed out and knocked the woman down with a fire poker. The police were called immediately. Upon further investigation, they uncovered a horrifying secret beneath the woman's house. Over the years, she had secretly dug an intricate network of tunnels underground. These tunnels not only extended beneath her home, but also reached under my aunt's, my grandparents', and another nearby house. Strangely, she had taken all the dirt from the tunnels and used it to create raised mounds in her backyard garden. But the most terrifying discovery was when the police found a strange underground shrine in the tunnel system. The shrine was filled with eerie symbols, and surrounding it were strange objects, including fake human heads like the one she had used to scare us on Halloween. Those heads looked incredibly real, but fortunately they were only props. My aunt survived the incident, but she carries a long scar on her neck, a permanent reminder of what happened. My family chose not to speak much about it in front of the children, but the event haunted me for years. Stories of the strange woman spread throughout the town, and no one dared go near her house again. After she was arrested, the woman was committed to a mental institution, and her house has been abandoned ever since. To this day, whenever I think back, I still get chills remembering that Halloween night. The banging, the image of the severed head, and her cold, lifeless eyes remain a haunting part of my childhood memories. This story I'm about to tell is one of the most terrifying memories from my childhood. Even though most people don't believe it when I tell them, I swear this actually happened. It's etched so deeply in my mind that I can never forget the intense fear I experienced that night. As a child, I loved weekends when my parents would let me stay up late. Weekends were the freest time for me, with no worries about school the next morning. I would sit up watching TV until late at night, only going to bed when I was too exhausted. My parents usually went to bed before me, leaving me alone in the living room, lounging on the sofa, eyes glued to the screen. I loved that feeling, absolute freedom, the house sinking into silence, and just me with my favorite shows. But one night, in the middle of that summer, something strange happened. It was a regular evening, and I was stretched out on the sofa, watching an old cartoon. My eyes began to droop, and I was almost asleep. Suddenly, a sound from outside woke me up. It was the creaking of the porch swing, moving strangely, as if someone was sitting on it, gently swinging back and forth. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just the wind, but the sound didn't stop. Something felt very off, and I couldn't lie still any longer. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Fear started creeping into my mind, but I couldn't resist the curiosity. I slowly got up from the sofa and walked toward the living room window. The large window had a direct view of our front porch, where our old swing sat. I tiptoed, peeking through the thin curtain, and when I saw what was outside, my heart nearly stopped. Sitting on the swing was an elderly woman, probably in her 50s. She wore a white nightgown stained with dirt and blood, her disheveled hair hanging down her face. But the most terrifying part was the large knife she held, the kind of kitchen knife my mum usually used. Her eyes were empty, vacant, yet gleamed with a kind of madness I couldn't explain. She sat there, rocking the swing steadily, as if nothing was wrong. But the blood covering her sent a chill down my spine. At that moment, I panicked. I didn't know what to do, but instinctively, I turned and ran toward my parents' room. I screamed, trying to explain what I had just seen, but the words caught in my throat, choked by fear. When I finally managed to say a few sentences, my father sat up, visibly annoyed. He thought I was just having a bad dream and dismissed everything I said. "Stop imagining things. Go back to bed," he said in a deep, stern voice. But I wouldn't give up. I cried, pleading with him, trying to convince him that something was really wrong. My father, now clearly fed up with me causing a scene in the middle of the night, finally decided to drag me to the front door to prove there was nothing outside. I didn't want to go. I kicked, screamed, and begged him to stop, but he still pulled me toward the door. As we got close, he unlocked it and pulled the door open, saying, "See, there's no one out here." But he didn't finish his sentence. I saw his face turn pale, his eyes widening in horror as he looked out onto the porch. The woman was still there, but this time, she wasn't just sitting. As the door opened, she slowly stood up, still gripping the knife tightly. She stared at us, her eyes dark and filled with insanity. My father immediately slammed the door shut, locking it, then yelled at my mum to call the police. I could see the tension in his face as he rushed to the bedroom to grab the 12-gauge shotgun he kept in the closet. He came back to the living room, cracked the door open just enough to point the barrel outside, and shouted at the woman, asking what she was doing on our porch. Her voice was raspy and weak, but I could still hear what she said clearly. "Someone killed my husband, but it wasn't me." That sentence hung in the still night air, making everything feel even more terrifying. My father, maintaining a calm voice, told her the police were on their way and advised her to leave. Suddenly, she panicked, gripped the knife tighter, and turned, running off the porch and disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. They found the woman at a nearby house, trying to break into one of our neighbors' homes. She was arrested without any resistance, but the terrifying scene remained etched in my mind. That night, I learned an important lesson about how the most unexpected things can happen in the most ordinary moments. What made it even scarier was that after she was arrested, my dad called my uncle, who lived right next door, to warn him. My uncle, a tough man, had been waiting on his front porch with a shotgun in his hands. As the woman passed by, he simply said, "Keep walking, you lunatic." I can never forget that night. Neither can my family. My parents never mentioned the event again, as if they wanted to bury the memory deep in the past. But for me, every time I see that porch swing, I remember that fateful night. I never sleep in the living room anymore, and I never sit on the sofa late at night by myself. And whenever I hear the creaking of the swing in the wind, I can't help but think of that woman, a ghost of madness who briefly stepped into our lives, even if only for a moment.